Long before history began, you already sense the weight of numbers, even though no one has yet invented the neat little grid of a spreadsheet. Imagine a dawn sky, pale, streaked with pink clouds, and a group of villagers being gathered into a square. Children are clutching at their mothers' skirts, elders are leaning on carved walking sticks, and you, well, you are shuffled in line, a bit unsure whether this whole thing is harmless head counting or a trap where you might lose your goat if you speak out of turn. But before we begin tonight's story, if you enjoy these calm history stories, please like the video and subscribe. Let us know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is for you right now. Your comments mean a lot to us. They help us to keep the work on. Your kind words are the biggest support we can get. Now, dim the lights and let's go back in time together. You soon notice that in many early societies, the census is not just practical bookkeeping. It is closer to a ceremony, a ritual with incense, officials in long robes, and sometimes a blessing at the end. In Mesopotamia, for instance, scribes would press their styluses into wet clay tablets, recording households with a devotion that feels more like priestly duty than civic paperwork. Skipping such a moment was almost unthinkable. Not because someone might fine you 50 coins, but because it felt like abandoning the gods themselves. Picture yourself in Egypt, standing along the Nile floodplain. The census is tied to taxes, and taxes are tied to irrigation, and irrigation is tied to whether the crops will even grow. When an official, painted with coal around the eyes, scribbles your name onto papyrus, you are not merely counted. You are folded into the great order of the kingdom. If you absent yourself, that order falters, at least in their minds, and you may be seen as tempting chaos. One rumor even tells of villagers who avoided census scribes being forced to work on canals for a season, digging mud under the merciless sun. Historians still argue whether these tales of punishment are exaggerated. Perhaps bedtime warnings told by parents to make their children obedient. But the theme remains. To dodge the count is to invite suspicion. It is a bit like ghosting a modern-day roll call, except instead of a teacher scolding you, it might be a priest accusing you of insulting the cosmic balance. And of course, you cannot help but smile at the pettiness of it. Imagine a weary official keeping tally, noticing your absence and muttering something like, "Very well, if you will not be counted, perhaps the gods will count you as missing." The humor is dark, yes, but there is always a thin line between cosmic order and bureaucratic annoyance. The mainstream fact here is simple. The world's oldest known censuses, from Babylonian tablets to Egyptian papyri, were less about democracy and more about tribute, taxation, and control. They were binding threads in the loom of empire. If a single thread slipped away, the whole pattern threatened to fray. One quirky tidbit. In some regions, census officials would sprinkle flour or ash on the doors of households that had complied. It was a quick, dusty checkmark of approval. So if you refused to be counted, your doorway remained bare. Everyone walking by could see, Here lives the stubborn family. Not quite the scarlet letter, but perhaps its flower-dusted cousin. As you stand in that imagined ancient village square, you sense the tension of obligation. Part of you wants to slip away, to hide behind the grain bins until the officials have passed. But another part realizes you probably will not survive this dodge. They know the village too well. They know the number of sheep. They even know the number of clay bowls in circulation. To vanish from the list is to invite a punishment both practical and peculiar. Maybe hauling stones for a temple. Maybe offering extra grain to the granaries. Or maybe, worse, being whispered about forever as the one who did not belong. So you stay in line. You shuffle forward. The sun warms your shoulders. And as the scribe scratches the last curve of your name into his tablet, you are reluctantly drawn back into the embrace of empire. You are counted. You are bound. And perhaps, just perhaps, you are safe from the odd little punishments that hover like gnats around those who refuse. The line moves on, and so do you. The counting is never ending, and soon you will find yourself standing in Rome itself, under the watchful eyes of stern censors, where punishment takes on an even sharper edge. The scene shifts, and now you find yourself beneath the Roman sun, standing among marble columns and cobblestone streets. It is noisier here than in the sleepy village squares of Mesopotamia or Egypt. Merchants shout, sandals slap against stone, and the air is thick with the smell of roasted garum, Rome's beloved fish sauce that, you admit, might keep you awake longer than it should. Here, the census is not merely a list. It is a declaration of who you are. When the censor calls your name, you are expected to step forward, hand upon your chest, and swear an oath of truth. You state your property, your family members, your slaves if you own them, and even the number of olive trees upon your land. It is both a confession and a performance, and the audience, your fellow citizens, are watching closely. Now, imagine the consequence of skipping this moment. Rome does not like gaps in its records. A citizen who avoids the census is not simply invisible, he is suspect. If you refuse to show, you might lose the right to own land, or to serve in the army, or even to vote in assemblies. The Romans had a word for this disgrace. Capit censi, literally, those counted by head alone. A polite way of saying, you own nothing and matter little. Historians still argue whether every punishment was enforced as strictly as the laws suggested, but the threat was enough. Failing to appear for census duty could strip away social rank like a toga unraveling thread by thread. One mainstream fact: the Roman censor was not just a bean counter. He was a guardian of morals. If he believed you lied, or skipped, or lived dishonorably, he could move you to a lower class. In effect, he could take away your dignity with a stroke of his stylus. Think of it as a bureaucratic demotion, like being downgraded from business class to the baggage hold. And here is a quirky tidbit for you. Records suggest that some Romans believed the gods themselves kept an invisible census in the heavens. So, to dodge the earthly version was to risk cosmic disapproval. It is one thing to upset an official with sandals and scrolls. It is another to have Jupiter himself frowning at your absence from the celestial roll call. You shift your feet in this Roman square, noticing the nervousness of the man in front of you. He hesitates before declaring his wealth. Too much honesty, and he will pay higher taxes. Too little honesty, and the censor may seize his property and shame him in front of everyone. It is a delicate balancing act, a performance with no applause. You wonder, half smiling, whether skipping census day altogether might have been easier. But then again, you recall the punishments: property seized, social standing shredded, perhaps even exile in extreme cases. Suddenly, the risk feels larger than the relief. There is also an open scholarly debate over whether Roman citizens ever deliberately exaggerated their wealth just to appear more prestigious in the eyes of neighbors. Was it worth paying extra taxes if it meant strutting around like a peacock in a higher class? No one can say for sure, but the idea adds another layer of strangeness to the ritual. Imagine bragging your way into a harsher tax bill just so your toga looks slightly shinier at dinner parties. The truth is, Rome made the census into theater. You did not only declare numbers, you declared allegiance, honesty, and your place in society. Skipping it was like refusing to appear on stage when your name is shouted. The curtain waits, the audience murmurs, and the censor raises his brow. And you are simply gone. The silence speaks louder than anything you might have said. So you take your turn. You place your hand upon your chest, voice steady, though your heart quickens. You announce your possessions, your household, your orchards. The censor makes his mark, and the marble city swallows your words whole. You have survived another census. No fines, no shame, no exile. Yet, as you walk away through the bustle of the forum, you cannot shake the thought of those who tried to vanish. The ones who thought they could simply melt into the crowd and escape being tallied. Some succeeded, at least for a time. Others found themselves stripped bare, not by sword or spear, but by the invisible knife of bureaucracy. The line of history pulls you forward again. Beyond Rome, beyond marble and togas, into the winding cobbled towns of medieval Europe, where punishment often looked less like confiscation and more like public embarrassment. The marble fades from view, and you find yourself wandering through the narrower streets of medieval Europe. The air is damp, thick with the scent of wood smoke and brewing ale. Roofs of thatched straw bend under the weight of rain, and chickens cluck indignantly as they scurry across the mud. You walk carefully, for every puddle is deeper than it looks, and your boots are not made for this. Here, the census looks less like the grand marble ritual of Rome, and more like a practical ledger kept by weary clerks. The counts are often organized by kings, dukes, or local lords, hungry to know how many people live on their lands, and, more importantly, how many taxes those people can be squeezed for. To them, the census is not sacred, it is revenue. And skipping it, that is like dodging the tavern bill after an especially long night. You shuffle into the town square where officials in cloaks and caps are reading names. Villagers are called one by one to swear their households, their oxen, their fields. Those who refuse to appear are quickly noted down, noted and fined. Money is the first punishment of the Middle Ages. If you try to slip away unseen, your purse will be lighter the next time you return. Historians still argue whether the fines were always collected, for record keeping was often sloppy, and corruption was everywhere. Sometimes the fines landed only on the unlucky, those without friends among the clerks. Other times, they fell on entire villages, forcing the guilty and innocent alike to grumble together at the unfairness of it all. But fines were only the beginning. If you became too brazen about avoiding the count, your punishment could become embarrassingly public. Imagine standing in the muddy square with neighbors pointing and whispering, while a bailiff reads your name aloud and declares you untrustworthy. In some towns, your shame would be marked by a colored hood or a painted badge, so that everyone could see. Here walks the one who tried to dodge responsibility. It is the medieval equivalent of being tagged in the town gossip column, only you cannot delete the post or change your profile picture. A mainstream fact. In England, after William the Conqueror's arrival, the famous Domesday Book of 1086 counted every plough, every pig, every cottage. If you were missing, it did not mean the king would shrug and forget you. It meant suspicion. Perhaps you were hiding wealth. Perhaps you were refusing your lord's rightful due. Punishments could include confiscation of land or being excluded from the village court. An exclusion in medieval society was nearly as bad as starvation. And here is a quirky tidbit. In some German towns, a census dodger might be forced to wear a donkey's tail tied to his belt as he paraded through the streets. The symbolism was clear. You had behaved like a stubborn ass. Everyone laughed, and laughter was part of the punishment. The sting of mockery sometimes outlasted the sting of the fine. You keep walking, boots slipping in the muck, and you imagine yourself called before the officials. Would you dare to lie? Would you dare to claim fewer cows than you actually have? The risk is real. If caught, your fine will double, and your name will linger in the records as a trickster. Medieval people cared deeply about reputation, sometimes more than about coin. So perhaps the shame of being branded deceitful is worse than losing a few pennies. An open scholarly debate continues about how thorough these censuses actually were. Were they sweeping, nation-spanning efforts? Or were they, more often, patchy and inconsistent, useful only to local lords who cared more for taxes than truth? Some scholars argue that peasants often slipped away successfully, hidden in the shadows of poorly drawn maps. Others believe the threat of fines and shaming kept compliance higher than we might think. No one can say for certain. Still, as you linger in the square, you cannot help but notice the humor tucked into the punishment. A donkey's tail, a painted hood, a loud reading of your name in the rain. Petty, yes, but also effective. It is the middle ground between losing everything and walking away untouched. It leaves a bruise on pride, not a wound on the body. And as the town bell tolls, you realize the theme repeating itself. Whether in Egypt, Rome, or medieval Europe, the message is always the same. If you will not be counted, you will still be marked. Your absence itself becomes a presence, a note of suspicion that hangs like smoke in the air. The smoke drifts with you now, carrying you westward across oceans, toward colonies where new towns rise. And punishments for dodging the census grow both harsher and stranger, sometimes involving wooden stocks and the laughter of an entire settlement. The damp fog of medieval streets clears, and you now find yourself stepping into the raw, bright air of early colonial America. The sound of axes rings in the forest, and the scent of fresh-cut timber lingers over the settlement. These towns are new, their fences still rough, their houses simple, and their rules, oh, their rules are strict. Here, every able body matters. A census is not just a list for taxation. It is survival itself. How many men can take up muskets? How many hands can harvest grain? How many children will need food through the harsh winter? Every number carries weight, and if you are missing, the entire fragile balance of the community feels threatened. So, what happens if you dodge this duty? If you sneak away into the woods or simply refuse to appear before the clerk? In many towns, the punishment is physical humiliation. Stocks, those wooden frames with holes for head and hands, wait in the middle of the square. You are placed inside, and everyone, from the preacher to the baker's boy, strolls past with a knowing smile. It is not a beating, not a whipping, but the slow burn of shame. Mainstream history reminds us that Puritan colonies in New England were meticulous about keeping order. They believed in counting every soul, every acre, and every cow. To them, refusing the census was almost refusing God's watchful eye. The ministers saw numbers as part of divine planning. So being punished in the stocks was not only civic justice, but also a reminder to repent. And yet, there is humor tucked here too. One quirky tidbit comes from reports of colonies where census dodgers were forced to wear placards around their necks with words like "refuser" painted in large letters. Imagine standing in the marketplace, the wooden sign swaying on your chest, while neighbors nudge each other and chuckle. It is the 17th century version of having your embarrassing mistake turned into a viral post for the entire town to see. You cannot help but imagine your own discomfort in those stocks. The wood presses hard against your neck. Your hands are trapped. Children throw pebbles near your feet, laughing, and time crawls. Perhaps it is only 2 hours, perhaps longer, but it feels eternal. The punishment is not meant to break bones, but to break pride. To tell you, in this new land, you will either be counted or you will be displayed. Historians still argue how often such punishments were actually used. Were the stocks regularly filled with dodgers, or only rarely to make a dramatic example? Some say the mere threat was usually enough, that most people appeared, grumbling but compliant. Others claim that frontier stubbornness led to more defiance than we imagine, forcing magistrates to make spectacles of the guilty. The truth may lie somewhere between. And yet, stocks were not the only tool. In some colonies, failure to appear for census duty could mean extra labor assigned by the community. You might find yourself ordered to repair fences, to clean muddy streets or to stand guard at night while others slept. Not glamorous chores, but effective reminders that hiding from the list only earns you heavier burdens. You pause in the square, watching the punishment play out. The man inside the stocks fidgets, his cheeks flushed. People walk past, some sympathetic, others amused. It is clear the town has made its point. The census is not optional, not here, where every missing name feels like a hole in the fragile fabric of survival. And as the sun begins to sink behind the crude wooden rooftops, your mind drifts beyond these colonies. For punishment, you realize, was not always so familiar, so wooden and public. In faraway kingdoms across oceans, census dodgers sometimes met stranger, more symbolic fates. Fates marked not by stocks or placards, but by ash, ritual, and forced labor woven into the rhythms of distant lands. The wooden stocks of the Colonial square dissolve, and you find yourself carried on a warm wind toward lands farther east and south. Lands where the census is not only a tool of rulers, but a reflection of culture, ritual, and sometimes fear. The air smells of spices, of burning incense, of river mud drying under the sun. Here, the punishments for dodging census duty are less about coins or shame and more about symbolism, a blend of the sacred and the strange. In certain Indian kingdoms, the census was tied directly to caste and land. A missed census appearance could mean being barred from temples or being forced into degrading labor, meant to purify your disobedience. Imagine being paraded through the village with your head smeared in ash, a public sign that you had failed the duties of a proper subject. The symbolism was potent. Ash meant both cleansing and humiliation. It marked you as one who tried to slip outside the order, and it made sure no one forgot. One mainstream fact: in Imperial China, the household registers were central to control. Skipping the census meant being erased from the hukou system, which tied you to your land, your taxes, and even your right to move. If you were missing, you could not legally marry or inherit or even be buried properly. It was as though your name vanished from the book of the living. And if the state later caught you, the punishment might be forced labor, assigned to build roads or haul bricks for walls that stretched for miles under the scorching sun. There is also a quirky tidbit from Japan's Edo period. Census registers there were often linked with religious temples, where families had to be listed not only for taxation, but for proof of Buddhist affiliation. If you dodged the register, you might be branded as a heretic or even suspected of being secretly Christian, a dangerous accusation in that time. And the punishment? Sometimes as simple and as cruel as being denied a burial when you died. Imagine the terror of not being counted in life and then not being permitted a resting place in death. You walk through these imagined streets, eyes wide at the variety of punishments. In Africa, certain kingdoms treated census dodgers as shirkers of communal duty. If you refused to be counted, you might find yourself assigned to carry water for weeks or forced to sweep public courtyards at dawn. It was not brutal, but it was meant to sting your pride. You, the one who refused to stand still for the tally, now made visible through endless labor until your absence was repaid in sweat. Historians still argue how widespread and how severe such punishments were. Were these accounts exaggerated by foreign visitors seeking exotic stories to bring home? Or did local rulers truly enforce symbolic punishments with this kind of precision? It is hard to know, but the patterns remain. Your absence was never ignored. It was always answered, often in ways designed to mark you publicly. The symbolism fascinates you. Stocks in America humiliated you physically, but here, ash on your forehead, a barred temple gate, or an erased name on a register strikes deeper into identity itself. You are not simply punished, you are denied belonging. And in societies where community and ritual bind people more tightly than chains, that is perhaps the harshest sentence of all. You imagine yourself, head bowed, ash stinging your eyes, while villagers glance sidelong. Or perhaps your name erased in a Chinese ledger, your existence suddenly unofficial, your family scrambling to explain why you are no longer recognized. A peculiar punishment, yet chilling in its finality. It is like being told you do not exist and will not until you submit to the count. And as you reflect on these strange rituals, you realize that even when the census was linked to the sacred, another authority was never far behind. The church, in many lands, took its own role in ensuring obedience. Sometimes spiritual, sometimes terrifying, but always close at hand. The wind shifts, and you feel yourself drawn toward cathedrals and cloisters, where bells toll, candles flicker, and priests keep their own version of the tally, with punishments aimed not at your body, but at your soul. The incense of foreign temples fades, and you now find yourself stepping into the cool hush of a medieval cathedral. Stone arches loom above you, candles flicker along the nave, and the faint echo of chanting drifts through the air. Here, the census takes on a new face. It is no longer just about kings and taxes. It is about God's flock, and every sheep must be counted. In many Christian lands, parish priests kept their own censuses, often called parish registers. They recorded baptisms, marriages, and burials, the full arc of a life. To refuse to appear in such lists was not just disobedience, it was a kind of spiritual rebellion. You were saying, in effect, that you did not belong to the body of the faithful. And the punishments? They were not always physical. Sometimes they were sharper because they reached into eternity. Mainstream history shows us that the Catholic Church could refuse sacraments to those who resisted being recorded. Imagine being barred from communion while your neighbors stepped forward to receive bread and wine. Your absence stood out in the candlelight. Whispers followed. Was he a heretic? Was she hiding sin? In a time when the sacraments were seen as the very road to salvation, being denied them was a punishment heavier than any fine. And there were stranger measures too. One quirky tidbit comes from certain small villages where priests ordered bell ringers to toll the funeral knell for census refusers, as though the person were already dead to the community. The villager would hear the bells themselves, a living ghost marked by sound. You cannot help but chuckle nervously, a rather dramatic way of saying, "Turn up next time." Yet historians still argue about how consistently such punishments were enforced. Were all refusers truly denied the sacraments, or was this mostly a threat whispered from the pulpit to keep order? Some scholars suggest the church was pragmatic. Too many refusers would weaken its power, so punishments were selective, reserved for those already on the edge of suspicion. You imagine yourself seated in a pew, watching as others shuffle forward. The priest nods to each, but when your turn comes, his hand rises sharply, denying you. The eyes of the congregation prick your skin like 1,000 tiny needles. You sit, heart heavy, and suddenly the stocks of Colonial squares seem almost merciful in comparison. At least those ended after a few hours. This question mark, this could stretch until your death. The church also used excommunication as a broader weapon. It was not always wielded for census refusal, but the threat lingered. To be cast out meant no sacraments, no Christian burial, no prayers for your soul. It was the ultimate erasure. The state could strip your land, but the church could strip your eternity. Of course, the punishments were not always grim. Sometimes they were almost theatrical. In certain places, if you avoided being counted, the priest might assign you extra penance, a pilgrimage to a shrine, or days of fasting, or kneeling in public prayer until your knees ached like old hinges. Not brutal, but deeply uncomfortable. A spiritual version of roadwork duty. You cannot help but see the pattern forming. The census is always about belonging. Whether to the king's treasury, the emperor's register, or God's flock, to dodge it is to risk being cast outside. And no matter the era, the punishments always serve the same reminder. You cannot vanish quietly. If you try, someone will make sure the world knows. As you leave the echoing cathedral, candles still glowing behind you, your footsteps carry you back into the streets. And now, you notice the flavor of punishment shifting once again. Less sacred, less eternal, and more bureaucratic. The officials of later centuries sometimes dropped the heavy hammer of religion or stocks, and instead reached for smaller, stranger tools. Tools of annoyance, tools of revenge. The kind of punishments that make you sigh and mutter, "Really? This is what you came up with?" The echo of cathedral bells fades, and you now find yourself in a cluttered office rather than a holy nave or a marble forum. Ink pots line the desks, scrolls and ledgers are stacked so high that you fear they might topple like dominoes. This is not the realm of priests or censors with cosmic authority. This is the realm of clerks. And clerks, you quickly discover, have their own peculiar sense of justice. By the time you reach the 17th and 18th centuries, bureaucracies across Europe and beyond are growing thicker than ivy on stone walls. If you refuse to appear for census duty, the punishment was often less about divine wrath and more about paperwork, inconvenience, and the subtle cruelty of civil servants who have grown tired of people ignoring their lists. Mainstream history tells us that some towns punished census dodgers by assigning them extra corvée labor, that is, work for the state. Perhaps you had to mend roads, clear ditches, or haul firewood for officials. Not glamorous jobs, but jobs meant to remind you that disappearing from the records only earned you more visibility in mud and sweat. But the real fun, if we can call it that, came with the petty, imaginative punishments. One quirky tidbit describes a village where census dodgers were deliberately misclassified. Officials would place them in the lowest tax bracket, not to spare them money, but to rob them of prestige. Imagine being a wealthy merchant suddenly listed as a pauper, your neighbors snickering as you insist, "No, truly, I own 3 warehouses." And the clerk replying dryly, "Not according to the census, you do not." In some cases, your punishment might involve extra tithes or odd duties invented on the spot. Perhaps you would be ordered to sweep town squares at dawn or serve as the official witness for endless minor legal disputes, dragged from your home repeatedly to stand in court and nod while 2 men argued over goats. A punishment not of pain, but of exhaustion and irritation. You sigh, realizing that bureaucracy has always excelled at inventing chores no one wants. Historians still argue about how formal such punishments really were. Were they written into law, or simply improvised by irritated officials who did not enjoy having gaps in their neat columns of ink? Some say they were codified, others claim they were petty acts of local revenge. The truth may be both. The law gave officials power, and human nature gave them creativity. You picture yourself in this scenario, sitting at your table when a messenger knocks. You are told you must carry stones to repair a bridge, not once, but every week for a month. Why? Because you dared to skip the census. The bridge, ironically, is hardly used, but your back is. And as you groan under the weight of stone, you mutter that perhaps showing up for the census would have been easier. The humor lies in the smallness of these punishments. No exile, no stocks, no spiritual death, just endless chores, embarrassing reclassifications, and the smug grin of clerks who finally have their revenge. It is, in its own way, more irritating than terrifying. The punishment does not ruin your life. It just makes you wish you had taken 5 minutes to stand in line and give your name. And yet, there is something revealing here. It shows how deeply the idea of the census was woven into governance. Even petty clerks felt empowered to invent punishments, to make examples of people. The act of being counted was so central to belonging that even its enforcement could be small, mocking, and personal. The stacks of parchment blur as you step away, the ink stains fading from your view. You're pulled forward again, out of the dusty offices and into the charged air of resistance. Because not everyone who skipped the census did so out of laziness or fear of taxes. Some refused deliberately. Some made their absence a statement, and their punishments, though sometimes severe, often transformed them into something else entirely, into symbols, into stories, into folk heroes. The smell of dust and ink lingers in your memory, but the scene changes. You are no longer among clerks who delight in minor acts of revenge. Now, You stand among men and women who refuse the census, not by accident, not by neglect, but by open defiance. Their eyes burn with conviction. They do not fear roadwork or fines. They fear something larger. Being known, being controlled, being measured by powers they do not trust. History tells us that resistance to the census has been surprisingly common. In ancient Rome, entire groups sometimes refused to appear, especially in conquered territories. To them, the census was not a neutral act of counting. It was a declaration of submission, a mark that they were no longer free. Skipping the count became a quiet rebellion, a whisper of identity in the face of empire. Mainstream records show that in Judea under Roman rule, the census was one of the sparks that ignited revolts. To be counted was to be taxed, to be reminded that you were not sovereign. Some citizens hid, others misled the officials, and some simply vanished into the hills. Rome's punishment for such defiance was not mild. You could lose property, or worse, be branded as an agitator. Yet the refusal to be counted continued, stubborn as weeds. There are quirkier tales too. One tidbit describes villages that would submit fake names en masse, listing their goats as cousins, their dogs as nephews, their cows as grandmothers. The officials, of course, were not fooled for long. But for a while, the census rolls looked like barnyard parades. The punishment, when uncovered, was severe. Confiscations, threats, and sometimes even military intervention. But the villagers would shrug, as if to say, "At least we had our joke before the hammer fell." Historians still argue about whether these small rebellions were truly political statements or simply desperate attempts to dodge taxes and conscription. Were people principled rebels, or just tired of giving up grain and sons? The debate endures, but in either case, their resistance echoes with the sound of human defiance. Step now into the colonial world. In early America, some Quaker communities resisted census taking, arguing that it violated conscience and tempted governments to misuse information. For them, to refuse was an act of faith. Punishments followed: fines, loss of property, and in rare cases, imprisonment. But resistance gave these communities a reputation for stubborn integrity. They believed they were protecting not just themselves, but their descendants from the reach of intrusive power. The pattern repeats in many lands. In India, in Africa, in far-off island kingdoms, some refused to stand and be counted. Sometimes they feared taxation. Sometimes they feared that the census was tied to curses or spiritual danger. And sometimes they simply saw it as the latest trick of colonizers. Their refusal, though punished, turned into quiet resistance. It became one more way to say no to powers that claimed authority. Picture yourself among them. The census official comes to your door. Behind him stands a guard. His parchment is ready. Your neighbors have given their names, but you fold your arms and shake your head. "No," you say, "you will not write me down." The room stills. The official frowns. The guard steps forward. Your refusal will cost you a fine, perhaps a beating, perhaps the loss of your land. But in that moment, you feel taller than the empire. You are invisible in the one way that matters. They cannot claim to own you on paper. The consequences were often harsh, but the legends were stronger. Rebels who resisted the census sometimes became folk heroes. Stories grew of the farmer who burned the census rolls, the mother who hid her children, the village that vanished into the forest. These tales were whispered like lullabies, soft reminders that not everyone bends to counting. And now you sense that rebellion's fire fades into something quieter, something more haunting. Because the greatest punishment for skipping the census was not always fines or stocks, nor exile or labor. Sometimes the punishment was silence. The silence of being erased. The silence of never existing at all in the records of history. The fire of rebellion smolders, but as you drift further into history, the voices of the defiant fade. What remains is the strange hush, the soft rustle of paper, and the feeling that someone, perhaps you, has been quietly written out of the story. For all the punishments that followed census evasion, the fines, the labor, the petty humiliations, the most peculiar consequence of all was invisibility. To skip the census was to erase yourself from the record, sometimes for good. And in a world where history depends on ink and parchment, erasure could be more devastating than a whipping. Think of it. Empires built their futures on the ledgers of names and numbers. If your name did not appear, you were, in official memory, a ghost. You could not claim land, you could not prove ancestry, you could not even be sure that your descendants would know that you had once walked the earth. The punishment was not loud. It was not public. It was a silence that outlived you. Mainstream history gives examples. In Rome, families who skipped the census sometimes lost legal recognition. Their children could not inherit property. Their marriages were not fully honored. Their citizenship rights withered away. It was as though the state placed a translucent sheet over them, blurring their presence. They lived, they breathed, but on paper they did not exist. There are quirkier cases too. One record tells of a man who dodged the census so effectively that centuries later, archaeologists found his tomb, rich, carved, beautifully adorned, but with no official record of his family line. To scholars, he is a puzzle piece with no box. They know he was wealthy, but the census books insist he was no one. Some whisper he orchestrated this erasure on purpose, preferring mystery to submission. If so, his punishment turned into his legend. Historians still argue about whether being erased from records was a punishment by design or simply an administrative accident. Did governments intend to silence these people forever? Or did the absence just happen because scribes could only work with the names given? The debate continues, and in that debate lies the final irony. Those who tried to disappear still provoke conversation hundreds of years later. Picture yourself again. You decide not to stand for the count. No whip strikes your back. No fine empties your purse. No stockade humbles you in the square. Instead, nothing happens. At first you feel relief, but years pass, and then decades. When land is divided, your heirs find their claim denied. When soldiers march through, your family cannot prove their rights. When the village elders retell its history, your name is never spoken. The punishment is not a blow. It is a silence so deep it drowns memory itself. The silence grows heavy. You begin to wonder if punishment by erasure was the cruelest trick of all. A beating heals, a fine fades, but absence lingers forever. No songs, no records, no stories, just a blank page where you once stood. And yet, perhaps that blankness is not only loss. Perhaps it is a kind of freedom. To slip the census is to slip the net. Your life remains your own, uncaptured, unmeasured. The empire cannot tax you, cannot conscript you, cannot even prove you were real. There is danger in that, yes, but also a strange liberation. You float in the margins, a quiet ghost in history, and no emperor can reach you there. The hush deepens. The ledger closes. Your name is gone, or maybe it was never written. You drift into that space where forgotten souls linger, not punished with chains, not scarred by rods, but punished by the world's forgetting. And in the stillness of that forgetting, you feel your eyes grow heavy. The night lengthens. The punishments fade. Even the scribes lay down their quills. What remains is the sound of your own breathing, soft, steady, like the turning of pages. You are here, you are remembered, you are counted, at least in this quiet telling. Let that be enough. Let that be peace. And now, as the story comes to its close, let your thoughts slow down. The harshness of punishments, the absurdity of punishments, the strangeness of punishments, all drift away like dust swept from a long-forgotten ledger. What lingers instead is the quiet rhythm of history itself, a rhythm that beats softly, patiently, as generations come and go. Breathe deeply now. Inhale the faint scent of parchment. Exhale the echo of crowded marketplaces where names were once shouted, then written down. All of it is distant. All of it belongs to another time. You are safe here, far from census officials, far from punishments. No one is knocking at your door. No one demands your name. You are free simply to rest. The stillness grows. Imagine yourself reclining in a quiet meadow. The grass bends gently, not with burden, but with a soft evening wind. Above you, the sky is painted with the fading blush of twilight. Stars appear one by one, like careful dots of ink on a parchment sky. You are part of that record now, not as a number, not as an entry in a ledger, but as a presence. Gentle, breathing, resting. The world around you softens. Voices that once demanded answers fade into whispers. The officials close their scrolls. The punishments dissolve into memory. What is left is only calm. Your body feels heavier, your thoughts lighter, as if sleep itself is a kind of merciful census, counting not your name, but your breaths, steady and slow. Let the images grow distant. The stocks, the fines, the vanished rebels. They are stories now, far behind you, woven into history's endless cloth. You walk away from them, step by step, into a quieter place. A place where no one measures, no one records, no one judges. Only rest, only peace, only sleep. Close your eyes. Feel yourself dissolve into the hush of forgotten pages. You are not punished here. You are cherished. You are safe. You are free to let go. The night gathers you gently in its arms, and the world itself turns softer, slower, quieter. Sleep comes like a kind scribe, writing not your debts, not your obligations, but only your dreams. Let those dreams unfold now, as you drift, as you float, as you rest. The story is finished, but your sleep has just begun. Sweet dreams.